Okay, Grace, are you ready?
All right. Yep. We'll go ahead and get started.
So we still have a lot of people who are joining, but and I see a question in the chat that well, welcome everyone. We're so glad that you're here for our first event. This is in webinar style, so you will not be able to see yourself. You'll be able to see the panelists and hear them. And if you have questions or comments, then you can put them in questions. Please try to put them in Q&A at the bottom and otherwise in chat. So my name is Christina Hanger. I'm a partner with Social Venture Partners Dallas. And we're very excited to have you here for our first event of the year. The Nonprofit Impact Institute is a project of SVP Dallas, and our purpose is to help train our partners, community leaders, and nonprofit leaders on best practices for running nonprofits and having impact in our community. So we're very glad to have you here for our first office hours. We have a great set of panelists for you, and it's my job to introduce them. I will not give you their complete bios because we would be here all day for that. But I want to just highlight some specific expertise because we picked them to be able to have the whole waterfront of fundraising covered. So first, we've got Mary Jelonic. Mary, many of you know, 30 years, the CEO of the Dallas Foundation. And so she obviously knows the grant process very well and knows how to work with foundations. But if you stop and think about it, somebody had to raise that money for them to be able to give away. So Mary's very knowledgeable about major donors. And I also always think of Mary as someone who's really spearheaded large community collaborations and really been able to work across groups to raise money. So it's a very specific kind of expertise. So welcome, Mary. We're so glad to have you. And then Ben Liao, who is CEO of the Addy Foundation. So also very well versed in the grant making process. Prior to that, he was CEO of Jubilee Park, which is a community-based nonprofit in East Dallas. And obviously they had a lot of foundation funding, but they also were very successful with corporate giving and corporate gifts that they were able to raise. And they also did a lot of government backed programming. So they had funding from ISDs and local governments and even HUD grants and federal government kind of grants. So he brings that expertise. And then we have Brian Millage, who's we're so glad to have Brian joining. And he is just recently joined Communities in School as their director of development. Brian has that foundation background or grant making background as well, but he also brings major donor experience, event experience, social media kind of fundraising. So between the three of them, they're all SVP partners. I was supposed to brag about them all for being SVP partners, but we're very happy to have all three of them. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Grace McClure-Tapetti from the SVP Dallas staff, and she is going to moderate the questions. Please feel free to put questions in the Q&A section. Thanks so much. Grace.
Thanks so much, Christina. Hello, everyone. My name is Grace McClure-Tapete. I'm the Director of Leadership Programs here on staff at SVP Dallas. We are so grateful to all of our panelists and also all of you for being with us here today. We hope that this session will be helpful and practical. We have such a wide variety of attendees today. We have a great representation of small nonprofits and medium-sized nonprofits. We've got some funders and SVP Dallas partners in the mix. So we're really excited about our conversation today. Just a few housekeeping things. Zoom might have notified you when you joined that there is a recording in progress. So we're recording this session. Yes, we will send it out afterwards. We'll send the recording link out to everybody who was registered. As Christina said, this is webinar style, so the only video, the only people that we will be recorded, are the panelists themselves, so you don't need to worry about that. However, you do have access to two functions down at the bottom of your screen. There's the chat, and so this is for just talking to other audience members and to everyone generally. The other function you'll see right next to it is Q&A. So if you have questions for our panelists, if you wouldn't mind putting those in the Q&A box, that's what we'll be pulling questions from today. So If you would, just by way of introduction, our attendees, if you would open the chat and just let us know what organization you're with and whether you have attended SVP Dallas events before. And then while folks are putting that in the chat, I'll get started with our first question. So we had some people email questions in beforehand. And I want to frame this a little bit by talking about, fundraising in Dallas. We know that fundraising is hard. It's hard for everyone, and it's especially when you're starting a new nonprofit, it can be difficult to know where to start. And so I'd like to start with the question of the beginning. So we had a lot of smaller nonprofits asking, how do I go about applying for and receiving our very first grant or our very first funding when I don't have a history to rely on and competing against people who've been here for 10 or 15 years? How do you do that? Brian, do you want to start?
Yeah, for sure. And thanks so much, Grace, for that introduction and starting off with the first question. I'll quickly speak on organizations that I've worked for in the past that, like you mentioned, were just starting out. And the biggest part was, well, where do we get funding? How do we apply for funding? Who do we go to know what's out there for funding for certain organizations? And being in a nonprofit space, being able to utilize resources such as the SVP or your local community foundations or even your public and private foundations. And more importantly, for me, it was all about networking, knowing that there's so many people in the nonprofit and philanthropic space who have been in this position, in these positions before, really leaning on them for support and pointing me into the right direction of, oh, if this is your mission alignment purpose, maybe you should reach out to X, Y, and Z organizations. And from there, really building a rapport of individuals and grants and foundational supports aside that can then assist me in the funding that could very much be needed to start the organization, let alone move towards the mission in which we signed up for. So honestly, just to wrap it up, leaning on people like the Graces of the world, the Bens, the Marys, the Christinas, and others in the network who have a wealth of experience and knowledge, but taking heat from them on how to get started with something that I'm very much passionate about. And from there, just building that repertoire of individuals and being able to figure out what other avenues we're able to receive funding, whether it's from, once again, your local foundation, public, private, or even national foundation, to then eventually moving up to the federal organizational grant and opportunities available. So hopefully that answers the question.
I'm going to add one thing. At Dallas Foundation, what I assume they're still doing, they did when I was there, but you just have to check the grant guidelines. But we did not fund startups. That someone had to be in business 3 to 5 years, and before we would actually consider them for a grant. And so really getting donations from individuals was the way to start, rather than starting with a foundation, because a lot of foundations won't fund startups.
And I would just add, I think it's also just about building your Rolodex. Never being afraid to enter a room, never be afraid to attend that event because you never know who you're going to meet or who you're going to come across at those social functions. I also think it's really important that as you are starting to identify which funding opportunities you want to go after, it's really important that you do your homework. Find out which foundations, which funders, which individuals are interested in your specific area. Find out how there's a connection between that funder and the work that you're doing. Just don't go in cold to these funders and expect them to be, oh yeah, I'm interested. No, make that connection, build that bridge, and show that there is a line between what they're funding and what you're doing.
Appreciate that, Ben. Thank you. On that note, so we've had some questions about specific types of funding. So somebody has asked in the Q&A, how do you build relationships with corporate funders, specifically with corporate giving programs, that sometimes just marketing and sending them your annual report doesn't seem to be enough? So how do you build those relationships to have those longer term institutional funding relationships?
I think, my opinion is you start leveraging your board. That's what your board is there to do. Obviously, you have different functions and different boards, but The board is really there to help you raise funds, make introductions and connections. Build your board to the caliber that you want it at, and make sure that the board members can introduce you to smart, capable corporate funders. I also want to, this isn't part of the question, Grace, but I also want to caution people who often think, oh, we're going to go after corporate funds. Well, you can go after corporate funds, but just be aware that going after corporate funding is a long game. It takes years to get funding on a larger scale from corporations. I mean, first it's going to be, hey, we'll send over some volunteers. Hey, we'll come over and do a project-based opportunity at your organization. It's going to take a few years to get those funders on the corporate side to actually pump in some money into your organization.
Mary, Brian, would you like to add to that?
The only thing I'd add is in corporations, generally, the person who is running the grant program also has another job. So, I mean, they're just doing this as one other thing in the corporation. So getting their attention is hard. I mean, it just is. So as Ben says, starting with volunteer opportunities and things like that can get you probably farther than just immediately trying to go in for money.
Yeah, and what I'll add too is that we're such a, of course, social media driven and very virtual world in a sense, but people are still having in-person activities, whether it's networking events, volunteer events, as Ben and Mary mentioned, or just events to bring internal and external partners together, and being very boots on the ground driven. I will likely research and show up to those events just so they can put an email or a DM or instant message to a face. And hopefully after being able to steward those relationships a little bit further, then they can maybe close the gap on those volunteer opportunities or those funding opportunities in the future. But definitely, to Ben's point, corporate relations and corporate funding is definitely a long game, but the earlier that you can be introduced to a corporate organization or entity or foundation, likely the quicker it may be able to speed up that process.
Yeah.
And like Mary said, I mean, usually the person who's having to place these volunteers and do the corporate giving has multiple hats that they're wearing. Anytime you can make your opportunity for that volunteer plug-in easy, all the better. Don't put the work on the corporate person to organize the volunteers, find out what they want to volunteer for, where they're going to show up, have the equipment ready. I have seen one agency do a spectacular job with volunteer engagement, especially on the corporate side, and that is United to Learn. It's super easy for them to plug and play volunteer opportunities for corporate funders as well.
Wonderful. Thank you all. On kind of a related note, we also got a question about governments and school districts, that once organizations are ready to start looking at those sort of government grants, school district grants, this can be a different kind of beast. So what would you recommend in terms of deciding when the time is right to take on a government grant, how to approach those programs, and how to really make the most of them?
I'll start. I'm just going to say, at Dallas Foundation, it's hard. You've got to have staff that to deal. There's so much paperwork, and we very rarely we have done it, but very rarely. So Ben, I think you or Brian may have done more of that than I have.
Yeah, you always have to weigh the positive outcomes when it comes to government funding. How much staff time am I going to put into filling out this grant application? How much staff time am I going to put into the reporting that's needed back to the government? And do I have enough cushion in my bank account to make sure that I can get paid back from the government within the 90 days that they say they're going to pay you back, which isn't always the case. So again, to Mary's point, make sure you have the staff, make sure you have the reporting processes in place, and make sure that you have the cushion to kind of provide any gap funding that may need to happen until the government gets you back your funding or your check.
Yeah, definitely in agreement with that. And we know that federal grants, government grants, and definitely working with partners such as school districts and other entities, it's a lot of reporting involved. It's a lot of people involved. It's a lot of moving parts. So from experience, I would definitely say just keep your eye on those applications and understand what's needed and necessary, and then likely practice for a year or two before you actually begin that application process, just so that you're well endowed of what's needed and expected from those reporting metrics, because it's a lot, whether it's pay stubs and signed documents from other parties that you're working with or collaborating with, as well as impact reports that's needed from those grant applications. It's a lot of work, and definitely more than just a 1 and 2 person team. So to the point that Ben made, just making sure that you're well prepared of what's expected, not just on the internal basis, but definitely externally when it comes to fulfilling what the reimbursements they may be asking for as well.
Yeah.
And I'll add that it's also a balancing game too. Government funding is great until it's gone. So you want to make sure that you have really good streams of revenue coming in at different areas: corporate, individual, foundation, government. It's a good mix.
Yeah, we're actually going to talk about that a little bit at the end of the session today. But on that note, actually, Ben, so a lot of government grants and school district grants are multi-year grants. And I know that a lot of funders run the same programs year over year. And so someone had sent in a question that said, we had a grant from a foundation, and then the next year when we applied to renew it, we got rejected. What do you suggest that we do?
I would recommend kind of doing your own internal review. So did I meet all the reporting requests? Did I meet all the outcomes I said I was going to have in my grant submission? Did I practice good stewardship? Stewardship is huge for funders. And it's not all about kissing the ring. It's not about, it's about engagement. It's about asking questions. It's about, hey, I saw this article and I thought you'd be interested in seeing it. Or, hey, we're having this open house and we'd love for you to come over and check it out if you have time. Those little touch points go a long way. I think once you've kind of looked at your reporting process, looked at your stewardship, looked at your outcomes, if you feel that you've done a good job, reach out to that program officer and say, hey, can we touch base and see where the disconnect was? We'd really like to continue a funding opportunity. Where can we make changes to better meet the needs and the outcomes that you were expecting on the funding side?
I've always said that in fundraising, the absolute key word is persistence. I mean, you just got to be persistent. And the thing is, for example, at Dallas Foundation, if you got a grant, you couldn't apply again for 3 years because we received so many grant requests. And so when you're thinking about applying, really think about what you need, because you can't come back for a couple of years. Private foundations like the Addy Foundation, where Ben is, sometimes they will do, multi-year funding, but it's really foundation specific. But all the tips that Ben had were good to touch base with the program officers, but also just make sure that it's a foundation that will fund continuously year after year.
Thank you. All right, so our Q&A is very active. So I'm going to start with this one. So this audience member said, most funders want program history and data to determine whether or not to fund. What advice do you have when asking funders to fund new and innovative programs that may not necessarily have proven data already, if you're starting a new program?
I'll start by saying that the narrative is such an important piece. How can you tell your story, of one, effectively, and two, how can you tell a story that sets your organization apart from all the other hundreds of thousands of organizations who may do almost similar work? So being able to, one, capture those stories of impact that you've been able to create in that short or long time span, and then being able to see what resonates with those funders, whether it's a private foundation or a public foundation, but seeing what works well with, one, their organization and foundational goals, but seeing what impact is being made with your organization that's also very similar or in alignment with the organization's or foundation's impact that they're trying to make.
A lot of foundations really love to see innovative programs that they're glad to see what an organization has been doing in the past and has a track record, but then to see that they're thinking in an innovative way how to make their organization better. A lot of foundations love seeing that.
I think the innovation for us at the Addy Foundation is what's going to help your organization scale. What's going to be able to help you serve more people. What are these reports going to mean for your partner agencies that you work with? That's what's innovation. That's innovative to us.
Wonderful. All right, so our next question is about leadership. So we've actually gotten a few sort of in the same realm. And it's around bringing in your board members to really support these fundraising efforts. So we have one question about how do you motivate your board members, and for things like helping your board members represent the organization publicly, whether it's making LinkedIn posts or giving them specific things to do. How do you motivate and keep those board members engaged in supporting your organization from a fundraising perspective?
When I was at Jubilee, I used to be the CEO at Jubilee. When I was at Jubilee, we actively engaged and had a working board, meaning that each board member was responsible for a certain committee. Each board member worked alongside staff, not directing staff, but working with staff and supporting staff in their expertise area, I guess you could say. That's how we kept our board engaged. Also, I think it's important that you have kind of a board boot camp before board members actually join, or before board members actually fill their slot on the board, of what the expectations are, having a clear job description for your board members, and showing them what the importance of connectivity and leveraging their relationships is to the organization and to the CEO.
I think fundraising is all about telling stories and so when your board members, they need to have stories to tell. And so when they're talking to their friends, why are you on this particular board? Well, the work that they do is, blank. And the thing is, what you want the board members to be able to do is to tell stories of people that the nonprofit has helped, how they've helped them, what their place is in the community. And maybe I've seen, which is really nice, is sometimes to have clients come in to board meetings and tell their stories about how the nonprofit helped them. So it's really all about telling stories when you're trying to get new donors.
And I'll definitely add on those sentiments, because I believe what you all mentioned are definitely in the right line, but really preparing your board for being an extension of the organization's team, especially when it comes to fundraising. During the Nonprofit Impact Institute's prior series of board engagement, we spoke highly on being able to have a advocating board that helps in all fundraising initiatives. Because in a sense, they're just as responsible for the well-being and financial positioning of an organization as the staff members are. So being sure that they're, one, well equipped to tell those stories, two, being sure that they're equipped to make an ask or put someone in a position to say, hey, this is what the funds are necessary for, but let me point you to a direct organizational member to kind of elaborate on what was mentioned. And three, just being sure that the board's comfortable in those positions of, one, not just being responsible for the organization's well-being, but that they're actively advocating and trying to position that organization in the best position possible for success. So really stewarding individuals to support the longevity of an organization. But once again, as Ben's point was briefly mentioned earlier, just being sure that they're equipped with a boot camp or prior board commitment strategic plan so that they can be in place for success overall.
Brian, do you
I
want to
will also add, Grace, that I think it's really important that board members understand at the end of the day, the CEO is the leader, and their job is to support and guide any way they can, but they're not there to direct staff. They're not there to give direct orders. That's the staff's role.
Yeah.
What I was going to say is, I do think also that it's a board member's responsibility to introduce the fundraiser to people. They don't have to make the ask. All they have to do is set up a lunch or set up a meeting, and then the staff member will do the asking and explain more about the nonprofit. I know at Dallas Foundation, several of our board members would say, gosh, I don't know that I can explain everything that Dallas Foundation does. And I said, you don't have to. You just, get me in front of them, and then I can do that.
Yeah. Brian, do you want to talk a little bit about social media in particular? Because I know the person who asked the question asked specifically about, should I be having my board members make LinkedIn posts? Do I provide the text for them? How do we take advantage of social media in a fundraising world?
Yeah, and I would be remiss if I didn't say this, but everyone on this call is very active in social media, especially LinkedIn, for the basic opportunity of being exposed and increasing your network across multiple channels. We know that in-person opportunities are great, but being able to build rapport on a platform as LinkedIn is definitely so important. But when it comes to social media, I think there are innovative ways to build a fundraising pipeline, to continue in stewarding a network of supportive individuals of an organization, or just to raise awareness. We know that platforms such as Instagram are great for sharing those micro-dosed pictures or videos or content around your successes for an organization. LinkedIn the same way, but just on the more professional kind of 8 to 5 or work week type aesthetic. You're able to comment with people across the metroplex, so that the same focus areas, but more importantly, across the nation and world around topics that actually matter to you and to those in your support group. But I think being able to include updates of what's happening at your organization is important to have people more engaged with the work that you're doing and can see the impact in somewhat of a real time aesthetic. And then from there, you can potentially make that ask and feel more comfortable in making that ask in person or at the next meeting or fundraising event that you have. But leveraging social media, especially the LinkedIn's, especially the Facebook or Instagrams, but more importantly, utilizing the platform that best works for your target audience, as well as the organizational needs of that particular organization that you're supporting. But in any and all cases, I would definitely strongly advise to leverage social media in any aspect that you can.
I'm going to stay on that topic of communication for just a moment and change tack just a little bit. So we got a question about, so from a fundraiser who has many years of experience and says, lately, more so than I have in the past, when I've been meeting with potential partners or donors, I've noticed that they've been asking personal questions regarding social issues or what I feel are my political beliefs. Have you experienced this? Is this more common in kind of the climate right now? And how do you manage those interactions so that you're representing the organization well and keeping on the task of what the organization's actual work is?
It's tough.
Go ahead.
Go ahead, Mary.
I was just going to say at Dallas Foundation, you absolutely have to stay politically neutral.
Mm-hmm.
And so, I mean, and you hear all sorts of stories from donors, about their experiences, and but we can't make political contributions anyway out of a donor advised fund. So I just think it's really important for the staff member to stay as politically and socially neutral as they can.
Yeah, I agree with Mary on that. Just staying neutral as much as you can, but then also driving it back. Let's redirect back to the mission of the organization.
Right.
Yeah. All right. In our Q&A, so quite a few questions. I love this audience. You guys are asking great stuff. So let's talk about specific fundraising activities. So we have one question that says, what are the most effective fundraising activities or events that you have experienced or perhaps that you've put on or sponsored? What makes an event successful? Brian, you want to start?
Yeah, I'll jump right in. The most successful events have definitely have changed based on the organization that I'm supporting or working for at the current time. I'll briefly talk on the organization that I helped co-found called Two Fly Foundation, which provides passports to Black and Brown students across the nation. But a big successful event for us was actually a lip sync battle. I mean, who would have thought that you bring something that you see on TV or something that you do for fun in your car in the shower when no one's watching into a public fundraising event? And it was successful basically because we had an initiative of how much money we wanted to raise, what type of event we wanted to raise for our targeted audience. And then lastly, bringing in individuals who were travelers, who had their passport, who were known to travel across the world for certain and different arrangements, but knew the importance of it and the effects that it had on their lives. So with that, creating an organization, one around that, but two, particularly creating an event around that mission alignment, it was great because we created an activity where people were able to not just participate, but then vote on their favorite acts, but then also donate money towards their favorite acts, which is great for fundraising. But it was an awesome event that was fun, yet very intentional. The last thing I'll say is that the community loved it because one, they were able to raise money for their cause, their favorite causes. They were able to support their friends, and then they were able to learn about an organization that they hopefully became passionate about as well. So that's definitely something that was unique in a sense, but also very successful.
Yeah, I love that attention to what your audience is really engaged in and what their experience is like. I know that really paying attention to that participant experience is an important part of making an event successful. Mary, Ben?
I agree with Brian. I think coming up with new and creative ways to engage and get people excited about the work. I've seen the lip sync battle fundraisers; those are always fun to go to. I've seen the pickleball tournaments now, and those are generating some good funds. I think what I'm seeing in my circle, and again, this is just what I'm seeing and what I'm hearing, is people are getting kind of burnt out on dinners. People are kind of getting burnt out on luncheons. I'd rather, and I know at the Addy Foundation that we would rather allocate funds directly to programmatic expenses instead of paying for a dinner or a celebrity speaker to come in. And people also, I think maybe COVID had an effect on this, but I think people want their evenings back. I think people want to spend time with their families. I think people want that time at home. So I'm not knocking events. I know they're necessary because you've got to build the brand, you've got to build awareness, but come up with a new creative way to roll those out. I probably just opened a can of worms,
You know,
and I'll hand it off to Mary now.
no, I was going to say the Dallas Foundation didn't do fundraising events, but I was just thinking of the fundraising events I like to go to. And it's rather than a luncheon or a dinner. I mean, it's always interesting if there's an interesting speaker. I mean, so I do that. But, sort of experiential kinds of things, like I thought of the zoo to do, things like that, where you can go someplace or if it's a family event or things like that, that are experiential rather than just sitting at a table and listening to somebody.
So we got a question on a really specific fundraising activity or rather a beneficiary. So one of our attendees is asking, my organization will soon be launching an endowment campaign. Can you speak to this process and what key steps we should prioritize? Mary?
Relationships. I mean, it's all endowment giving is the hardest really to raise. Bequests are actually the best if you can get in someone's will. And so they have to believe in you, they have to believe in the organization, they have to trust you. And so it's long term. Endowment campaigns are not like capital campaigns where you're building a building and it's over soon, you can see the building. I mean, this is long term, but and there are all sorts of, like remainder trusts and all those kind of fancy things, which you can get expertise from lawyers in town about, but simple bequests are really the easiest place to start for and really generally people will leave more money to you in their will than they will actually give during their lifetime.
Yeah, I think that point about, oh, sorry, go ahead, Ben.
Go ahead, Grace.
I was going to say that point about relationships is so important, that it really is, those authentic, meaningful connections and really representing your organization authentically and finding people that resonate with that.
I think it's all about, obviously the relationships, but also knowing your history and having a vision of what the future looks like for that agency as they start developing an endowment, creating an endowment board of past board members and current board members to serve on that, engaging with an estate planner, an attorney, or a financial advisor that can have the best practices and policies in place to help you kind of guide that paperwork. is important to set up. But again, I think you really have to do your groundwork on setting a picture or setting a stage of what the future looks like for that agency and why an endowment is so important.
Yeah, yeah. So a related question to that point, what is the best way to foster new relationships? Maybe this organization is new to Dallas or is not, quite so recognizable as, Girl Scouts, Boys and Girls Club, kind of those household names. How do you start those new relationships? How do you find your people?
I can't stress it enough, relationships and networking. But to build new organizational faith or capacity, I think it's all about just that initial introduction. We know how meaningful words can be, or painting the picture, or offering someone an annual report. But if you can actually show the impact being made, or if you have a physical facility, having that time to take for a tour, or simply introducing someone to the aesthetics of the organization and the work that we do, can definitely be an important feature and factor. But then also just one really captivating on that storytelling aspect that we mentioned earlier, being able to tell someone and paint them a picture with words, of course, of why the organization was started, what's its intent for the community at large, but also the intent for that community and client base that you're serving. I think once you're able to effectively communicate that, then you could truly gain supporters out of one individual, and then just branching off from that person to their neighborhood community, to their employer, to their coworkers, to their faith-based background, and then see what other like-minded individuals that they're connected to, and then just more, once again, building that branch even larger. And from there, you're able to gain so much support that you likely wouldn't have envisioned by connecting with one person. So I think that has truly been beneficial in my line of work thus far, and we'll continue to use that method until the end of times.
So this is related to another question that we got about boards specifically, and maybe we've already touched on this a little bit, but this organization has a really active, engaged, enthusiastic board, but the board members aren't necessarily connected to a lot of high net worth individuals. Do you think that that's a problem? How do we sort of expand that network? And it sounds like friends of friends of friends, and just really engaging with everyone you meet. Mary, do you want to add to that?
I was going to say that the networking, that Brown was talking about, is so important. I mean, through where you work. I mean, there are people there that perhaps would be interested in what you're doing. And if it's education, the parents of the students, if it's healthcare, and patients and their families, and who have been helped by your organization. So networking is just the key to the whole thing. And board members networking, they have access to people that are donors. They just don't know it yet.
I think it's also important for organizations to kind of develop a board rubric. What are you looking for on your board? It's great that you've got a passion for whatever cause it is, but if your passion doesn't connect to who am I going to introduce to this work, what skills do I bring to this work, it's kind of all for nothing. I hate saying that, but you need to develop a rubric of, we are looking for someone who has accounting experience. We're looking for someone that has HR experience. We're looking for that community volunteer who's an advocate and at every event. You need to be able to have those in a spreadsheet and be able to check off each box and make sure that you're getting the needs you need on your board to leverage those relationships, to leverage those connections, to make those introductions. I think it's really important.
Yeah. I'm going to take a minute here to plug our next office hours, which is going to be focused on board and board governance. So we'll have those dates at the end of this session, but keep an eye out for that one. Certainly there's lots of resources out there, and SVP Dallas is happy to connect folks with there's resources for figuring out, how do I really make the most of my board and keep folks engaged. All right. So, individual, I should say, we have in America, certain days where people give, right? We know that a lot of people give at the end of the year. A lot of people give on Giving Tuesday. In North Texas, we're lucky to have North Texas Giving Day. But some organizations are struggling to really leverage that and really make the most out of it. And they're wondering if you have any specific tips.
I think in my past
Social
experience
media
on, oh,
is
sorry, go ahead, Mary.
I was just gonna say, social media is king on that one. And the thing is, also, be sure if it's the end of the year, send out an end of the year letter. I mean, a lot of times I've forgotten that I should have given to somebody, but if I get the reminder letter, I go, oh yeah, I need to do that.
Mhm.
And so just, you know, even if it's a postcard, especially social media, I mean, just remind people that this is happening and it's time for you to pony up and give your check.
Yeah. I think that's important. It's the build up to, I mean, it's like example, North Texas Giving Day. It's the build up. You know that day is coming every year. Why haven't you sent out your postcard? Why haven't you had a presence on social media saying, hey, 4 days until Giving Day, reminding people? I know it's kind of annoying, but people need to be touched and reminded multiple times so they can make that gift. I also think it's also important to be that creative piece again. I remember one year when I was participating in North Texas Giving Day, if we hit a certain goal, I sang karaoke at a community event. So it got people excited, you know, it was something different, something unique. But then also what we did is we leveraged any kind of matching opportunity. So we would go back through our donor books and say, oh, you know, Joe Schmo is going to give a $20,000 gift during this time. Can we contact him or her and say, can we leverage that gift and use it as a matching opportunity and promote it for our North Texas Giving Day or whatever kind of event's coming out? And that proved to be very successful.
And
And
I'll
what's your
quickly,
goal for Giving Day? You know, make sure that everybody knows you've got a goal for Giving Day. So, you know, we're getting closer to the goal, you know, during the day, during the actual day. So go ahead. Sorry, Brian, I interrupted.
No, you took the words right out of my mouth. I was going to say, be sure you have a goal in mind or be able to visibly tell what that goal is to the public so they know what they're fundraising for as far as the impact being made or the dollars that are attached to that, right? And I'll also add that just the same way that we see the different holidays, we know that they're coming up because we see the markers, we hear the music, we see the things in the grocery stores. Do the same thing with your organization. You have the posts, you have newsletters, you have social media, you have postcards or whatever it may be. You have so many opportunities to tell people what's coming, but also what are your needs for that upcoming Giving Day. So in retrospect to North Texas Giving Day, I mean, we're fortunate to have such a philanthropic day in North Texas, thanks to CFT and other community members, but there's so many other days that are attested to fundraising. But I will also add that with any organization, it's finding that time of year that you deem most successful for your efforts. There are a lot of organizations who may have events, you know, in the spring or April or whatever it may be, or the end of year campaigns, as Mary mentioned. Whatever your most successful fundraising time is, make sure people know about it because they don't know how or when to give you money if you don't ask, if you don't tell why, or if you don't at least associate what impact it can cause because of it. So I think that all of those are great attributes to having a successful campaign season or campaign day, depending on what you're looking forward to in the end.
Yeah. And if you know that summer is your slow time for fundraising, we should have a summer campaign. And every summer there is a summer day of learning day. There's a day for everything now. There's a summer day of learning day, and you can build a campaign around that of setting a goal. And we're trying to raise this much money. That way we can keep our summer camp, you know, rolling.
Yeah, I know in my experience, having that really tangible, this is what you are supporting, whether it's, you know, a specific campaign or a specific program, having that really tangible so people know what their money is doing in the community and what impact it has is really helpful in motivating people. On the note of being sort of visible and having targeted giving, we have a question from the audience. Is there a way to position yourself to become beneficiaries of a fundraising event that another organization is putting on?
think I can't wait for Ben and Mary to help me out with this one. Um, but I think it truly comes from the network that you're able to build prior to becoming a beneficiary to those events, right? There's so many, sorry for the background noise. Um, there's so many opportunities for people to become enthralled with the work that you're doing and become passionate about it. And I think they'll take it upon themselves to make an organization a beneficiary when they want to add a supportive network behind the reason why they started supporting their organization in the first place. But happy to hear Mary and Ben's thoughts on that as well.
And some organizations actually have like a competition for who they're going to support each year. So you just need to find out how to apply, for those kinds of opportunities.
Yeah. And I think it ties back into that corporate side. We can go back to corporate. When you can engage those volunteers eventually, hopefully, will become donors. And those volunteers go back to their company when there's a golf tournament or when there's the days that you can pay to wear jeans, it's an opportunity for them to go back to their corporation and say, hey, I want to highlight this great organization that I volunteered with. And now you've developed a volunteer into an individual donor, and now it's going into a corporate gift.
And I'll also ask everyone too, is it often that you see an organization is asking to be a beneficiary of the event, or is it more likely that you see the company asking the organizations to be the beneficiary of their event?
I've seen it where the company's asking the organization. I've never really seen it the organization asking.
I mean, there's some big ones like Crystal Charity Ball where you have to, apply, and it's a big process. So there are ones where you apply, but those are generally much larger organizations that have a whole setup around that.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I will say in my experience, it's often the organization asking someone to be the beneficiary, and often those are long pre-existing relationships where they've had a volunteer engagement, they've had some smaller grants to the organization, they know the folks, they know that they're reliable and that the organization is going to be well served by putting that nonprofit's name all over their marketing for that year. So again, back to those relationships, that's just so important to keep those up and to keep them going long term. What is the best approach to get invited to apply for an invitation-only grant opportunity? Speaking of invitations.
Speaking of invitation, the Addy Foundation is a private family foundation, and we're invitation only. The best way is to reach out, send an email. I mean, my job is to be active and involved and engaged in the community. And I don't want to speak for my peers, but I feel that if a foundation director isn't responding back to your calls, isn't responding back to your emails, then they're not really doing their job. And I hate saying that, and we're flooded. I'm not dissing it, but I'm just saying, reach out, send over some information, reach out for a coffee, ask to come by and share the story of your organization. But I say that when you're coming over to visit with us about your work, make sure that you have key information, make sure you know your P&L, make sure that you know the size of your budget, make sure you know where your challenges are, make sure you've done your homework and know where we fund specifically, and say, I've noticed that you like doing mental health access. Well, here's a program that we have and that we're having challenges raising and securing funds for. Engage, highlight the challenge, and show how that foundation can plug in and assist that challenging area.
Yeah.
I want to add to knowing what the foundation, what their mission is, what are the kinds of grants that they make, because I've seen where nonprofits will just scattershot. I mean, they'll just send out proposals or inquiries, and they have what their organization does is not anywhere near what the foundation funds. So do your research before you contact anybody, because especially private foundations, they all have a point of view, they have the types of funds. You can look up on their 990 and see what they funded in the past. Are you in the type of organization that they generally fund? So do your research first.
That research piece is so important. And it's always cringing to me sometimes whenever you're visiting with an agency and they're like, well, how much do you think we should ask for? I don't know. It's like, what's your program expense? What do you think a good request in that specific program area is and should be? So again, do your homework, do your research. Look at those 990s. They're all public information.
And you can also see if don't ask for $1 million if you know that they don't give $1 million. I mean, you know, they don't, you know, they just, you've never seen, if you look on their 990s, there are no big grants like that. So, I mean, be realistic.
On that note of types of funding and types of grants, what experience or advice can you offer around requesting zero or low interest loans from foundations to support bridge funding for a project? So we talked earlier about that first funding. Sometimes you need, or government funding rather, sometimes you need some bridge funding to make it happen. And are there instances where those loans may be forgiven, or are there other options that are better? What sort of types of funding are out there and available?
We don't do bridge funding or loans at the Addy Foundation.
Yeah.
It's strictly grants, so I'm not versed to answer that one.
I don't think, I can't even think of an instance when we did that at Dallas Foundation.
Yeah.
I think this is the one time we're stumped.
Well, it sounds like it really, the answer is to find out what the organization you're asking for funding from actually does. Make your ask really tailored to what they actually do, because they've got their priorities and mechanisms worked out ahead of time. And again, back to that research. Yeah. Christina would like to jump in to answer this one.
So only because the panel is stumped. I know some very large national foundations that will do this, but only with organizations where they already have a relationship. So it is not how you start a relationship with anybody. It's a pretty tough ask, but there are a few people out there, but you would already know who they were, and you would have a relationship and know that you could go ahead and ask. Okay, I'm back out. I'm handing Grace little pieces of paper and notes, so that's why I went off camera. So.
All right. Let's see. If a foundation doesn't have specific application guidelines, I'm curious, how many pages do you like to see in a grant application? Ours are typically around 5 pages. Is that too long? Are we still in line with what foundations like to see if they don't have other specific requirements?
So the Addy Foundation, I like to think we're pretty simple. We try to keep the application process as easy as possible. So since we're invitation only, what happens for us is it starts off with the conversation, get to know the organization, talk a little bit. Then if we're interested and we do see potential alignment, it rolls out into an LOI. An LOI for us is, hey, here's the challenge. Here's how the Addy Foundation can support, and here's the need. So it's 3,000 words or less on our LOI to us. If the LOI makes it past that review process and they've passed the check on the nonprofit, they move into the application process for us. And our application process is pretty straightforward. I like to think we're pretty simple. Again, just highlighting the needs, and each one of our answers in our application is actually capped at, I think, 2,500 words. So we like to keep it as short as possible. And then if funding, and if funding is secured from the Addy Foundation, there's only 3 follow-ups from us. It's basically you agree to use the funds how you said you were going to use them. It's a tax letter, and then the final piece is a feedback and learning. Basically, here's how the funding was used, and here's how it helped, and then here's how the Addy Foundation can be a better partner. So we'd like to keep it simple on our end.
Dallas Foundation has an online application process, but the main thing is don't inundate people with words that tell me right off the bat, you know, what is it that what is it that you're doing? What is it that you want to do better? What is it that you want to do new? It's just sometimes people feel like they just need to tell you every detail about their agency, and you don't. I mean, really, that's why you have word limits on there, is because it's really hard to slog through, when you get a whole lot of it, of proposals, all of a sudden they start to look alike. And how can you make yours in where you have a real issue that you want to talk about, but you can talk about it in a specific, short way, not more words is not better.
Like, don't make me dig for the answer.
That's the point.
Uh-huh.
Brian, did you want to add anything there?
What I hear is effectiveness and efficiency when it comes to eloquently telling your story of why you need funding, why your organization is interesting, what you will do with the funds if awarded, in a concise way or in the max amount of words or limits that you are allowed. For many grants that I've applied for, and often when I award grants through Two Foundation, it's exactly what Ben and Mary mentioned. If we ask you a specific question, answer that question in the space allowed it. You will likely have another space to answer whatever else you may want to add, or a narrative piece of tell me more. But when it comes to those applications, just be as concise and efficient as possible. Because to Mary's point, we do review a lot of grants. We see a lot of words, and if we quote unquote don't see that there's a connect between an application and the next, then that could definitely impact the award funding process.
Yeah.
So be efficient.
Yeah. And I know, so kind of on the flip side of it, this discussion is happening in a lot of funder circles in Dallas as well about how to make that application process more approachable, simpler for nonprofits. And so if you're in a position where you've had a grant program, you've had a relationship with an organization and they ask you for feedback, particularly if they ask you for feedback on the grant process, really be honest about, man, I really struggled with the length. It took a lot of staff hours to write your grant application. Or even if you're in the application process, if you have a question, if you don't understand what they're asking for, there's often a staff person who will talk to you before you submit the application about what that means and how best to answer it. So definitely don't be afraid to ask those questions and give feedback when funders ask for it.
Yeah, and I think that's important, Grace. What you mentioned is before you click submit, reach out to that program officer or to whoever and say, hey, do you mind looking at it, or do you mind reviewing it with me really quick to make sure I answered all the questions or it's all needed? Because once you click submit, it's in the system and you really can't make any changes, at least on our end. So ask for feedback, ask for guidance, ask for that help. It's so important.
Yep, for sure. I just want to draw attention to a note that someone has put in the chat that I thought was really helpful, which is Michelle has shared, to anyone wondering about how best to access information about foundations, the Dallas Public Library provides free access to the foundation directory online, which is expensive for small organizations to purchase on their own. So definitely take advantage of that library resource.
And if anybody knows what they're talking about, it's Michelle. The King Foundation does wonderful work out there.
Thank you so much for sharing, Michelle. All right. One more question from our Q&A box. Going back to the topic of boards and engaging your boards, what is an appropriate division of labor, so to speak, for fundraising between the board versus the executive director or the staff, maybe perhaps in a small organization where there isn't necessarily a director of development?
I'll start this one off. I really think that when it comes to the division of labor with the board, when it in a comparison to the smaller organizational team, they're just an extension of the work that we're doing. Mary mentioned it earlier, but I think just simple introductions from the board member to the nonprofits organizational leadership team can definitely be beneficial. I think with, there's not many fundraisers on teams, of course, typically one when you're just starting out, maybe building up to a maximum of 3 to 4 in time. But the more conversations you can have with external partners or just meetings about the work that you're doing can become fruitful. And it just takes time. But I think that's a good first step in working with your board to simply say, hey, have you thought about working with X energy company, or this may be in alignment with X gas company or engineering firm or what have you. And I think by simply making those introductions of, hey, I know somebody in this department to said nonprofit organization, that could be simply the seed to a fruitful partnership in the long run.
I think for the smaller organizations out there that don't have a development director or development person, working with your board member on that as the development chair to really develop a development plan and setting expectations and goals of how many volunteer hours are we looking to engage throughout this year? How many corporate donors are we looking to touch on this year? What family foundations, what funders are we looking to engage with, and what level are we trying to achieve in each section throughout the year? That way the CEO, the executive director, has what they feel like a team member, a staff person, usually a board member, helping them launch and develop that plan, roll out that plan. I don't know if that answered anything. I just kind of rambled at the end, but
we love a good plan, Ben.
Goes a long way.
Also have specific things that you ask your board member to do. Like, for example, would each board member turn in 5 names of people that they could introduce me to? Or, just so you need to have some specific asks of your board members on what they can do to help. And then they'll feel some pressure to do it.
I mean, I always thought it was helpful at the end of each board meeting to allocate a little bit of time. You throw some names up on the screen and you're like, who has a connection at this company? Who knows this individual? That way you kind of build out from there.
And it makes you think of other people. You see one name and but then, this is somebody else. So it's just throwing out names is a great idea.
A good brainstorming session at the end of every meeting is always a good time to suggest those names. So that's a good point, Ben.
This is great stuff, great practical advice. I am going to change perspective just a little bit. So we have a question from someone who works in corporate and is looking to get their company more engaged in nonprofit work. How can for-profit companies best help nonprofits? It seems that we get asked a lot to give favors for conferences, but we want to do something more impactful. Sponsoring events, I'm sure, is always helpful, but is there anything else? Are there other ways that we can get involved?
Thanks, Grace. I first think about the skill set of the organization that you work for. For instance, there's a lot of, as we know, banking and financial institutions in Dallas that are offering financial literacy classes or courses for nonprofit clients, or they can potentially help with the finances of a nonprofit organization's cohort or mission focus area or what have you. Or I just think if there's alignment with the work that you do for the community, there's also alignment with the work that you do for nonprofit organizations, and just finding out what may work best for those entities. As we all know, with CSR goals is attached to oil and gas companies or financial institutions. A lot of that work can be done for the nonprofits who are doing the work in those same arenas. And just having that meeting or that conversation to say, hey, if I have this skill set, how could it potentially benefit you? Or if I have a team of individuals at this organization who want to spend time in creating a green space for a food desert organization, well, guess what? We could probably align and make something happen with that. So I think those conversations can definitely be had if, and I'll say the sky's the limit, and just figuring out what works best for both parties involved.
Yeah. I think it's also just like looking out your window, looking into the community where your office is at, and looking about what the need is in your surrounding area. Also looking internally at your staff. Where is your staff volunteering their time at? Maybe that's where the company wants to plug in as well. And I also think it's important for companies to highlight any matching opportunities that they offer their employees. So if I volunteer my time at a nonprofit and I know that my company pays $50 an hour for me to volunteer my time, I want to promote that so nonprofits are aware so they can engage with me. Also, I want to highlight if there's any matching opportunities. So if I give to an organization that I volunteer or give my time, give my treasure to, that it's going to be matched by my company. Those are things that need to be promoted and plugged in. That way more nonprofits are aware.
You know, one of the nicest that I saw was a corporation that had a committee of employees that would get together and talk about, and they would send out surveys and they would talk to their fellow employees about what kinds of issues where did they want to volunteer? What are the things that they cared about? Was it, you know, food security? Was it education? What is it that the employees themselves really wanted to do and wanted to give money to? And then the corporation gave them a certain amount of money to this committee, and you know, people and the employees could vote on it. So I mean, it was very team building for the corporation, and it worked very nicely. And people were really, they felt honored to be on that committee.
That's a great way to get employees engaged as well.
Mhm.
I know that at SVP Dallas, we have a program called Partner and Prosper, where we help manage those relationships between corporate entities and smaller nonprofits and match organizations that have similar values and goals. Because it takes a lot to, you know, to run those employee committees sometimes. And so we do a lot of work trying to help make that as seamless as possible for all the parties involved. So that's a great way to get involved. All right. I think that is where we're going to stop on questions for today. What I would love to do is switch gears a little bit and talk about other resources where folks can go get help with fundraising topics. So I'll open it up to panelists first. Are there any resources that you guys use that you really highly recommend for when people have questions about fundraising? Or that you use often?
This is my plug for SVP. I use this network. I mean, I've had a few conversations with Ben. We'll likely be having more conversations with Mary, Christina, but then all of the partners at SVP, and of course the Impact Nonprofit Impact Institute, excuse me, has been a huge resource just for knowledge, just for the breadth of social capitalism that's within this organization is pivotal. To the work that I've done in a nonprofit and philanthropic space in North Texas, but it's helped me literally across the nation. So finding your network of supporters who are doing the same work as you, who may have a different lens or breadth of experience, are always beneficial. And this group has been extremely beneficial to me. So very appreciative.
Appreciate that, Brian.
I echo what Brian says. SVP is a huge resource that people need to take more advantage of. Myself, whenever I need more assistance or guidance in what I'm doing now at the IDI Foundation, I rely heavily on my network, so my other funding friends, but then I also am a proud member of Philanthropy Southwest, and I continue my learning process and journey with that organization as well.
There's also the Association of Fundraising Professionals
Mhm.
that, you know, that they are also a resource. So, I mean, they're places to go, but so much of it has to do with experience. It's just, you know, you need to start and, you know, get and feel comfortable asking people to support your organization.
Yeah, fundraising is really an art and a science. It's a whole field of study, and there are lots of resources out there. We're big fans here of the Association of Professional Fundraisers. I did want to mention that they do have a conference coming up in Dallas, actually, in June 6th and 7th. We'll be there, so that if you're wanting to really build your skills in this area, that's a great place to start. I am going to go ahead and ask Brian Joseph to rejoin our panel. Brian is the CEO of RevGen Group, which is an organization that SVP Dallas partners with to really help organizations think deeply about revenue, about where money is coming from and how to make the most of it. I want to thank our panelists. Thank you so much for being with us today. We really appreciate you being here to share your expertise. Brian is going to talk just a little bit about RevGen and some of the opportunities that are available for nonprofits that might be on this call, and then we'll have a quick poll at the end. But thank you all so much for being here with us. We appreciate your time. And please stay on and listen if you like.
Thanks, Grace. And to the panelists, this was a great session. A lot of wisdom and insights that were shared. And I know everybody was probably taking furious notes, as was I. So thank you so much for doing this. I'm just going to talk for 2 quick seconds on RevGen, just to share with everybody. If you're not familiar with the work that we do, please reach out to us. We have our Fuelworks, our revenue infrastructure training, where we try to focus leadership teams on the root causes versus just symptoms of the revenue challenges. And when I use revenue, it's earned, contributive government, any dollar in the door. But really, our training is designed for that executive leadership team to put in a solid, we call it, using house as an analogy, the foundation and infrastructure for everything else to be built upon. And we really try to say that we focus on a common language, a common framework, and then providing the dedicated time in a structured process with use cases for organizations to go through. I could share a lot about the details. Instead, I would say go to our website, check us out on LinkedIn, and come talk to us, and we can share specifics. Instead, what I would do is just share 3 statistics that come from hundreds of organizations that we've trained around the country. When we go back 12 months later, we ask the leadership team what's changed. And these 3 stats are what always jumps out at me is 80% say their team is more equipped to make more informed strategic decisions around revenue. 84% say they're now more strategic and less reactive to the revenue generation, and 91% say their long-term revenue has improved. So the results, I think, definitely speak for themselves, but come reach out to us. The other thing that I'll mention is through our partnership both with SVP and then the broader funding community here in North Texas and in other regions. We have funding available to cover the cost of participating in the training. So there's scholarships available. We have some funders who provide it for their portfolio, so we can go through that with you. And then we also have general scholarships. So even if you don't know somebody, we may have scholarships available that we can help you, because we definitely want to remove that from a barrier. But overall, look us up, come see us. We'd love to talk to you and see if we can do the same thing for you all that we've done before. And again, I just want to thank everybody for being here, and thank the panelists.
Thanks so much, Brian. The resources that RevGen Group puts out are really great. I've been through them, and it's great content if you're really looking to build your skills as a leader in this area. I know that some folks have added to the chat some resources, and we've had so many that were mentioned here today. We will be sending all of those out in our follow-up email along with the recording to the session. So if you have colleagues that you think should have been here and you want them to listen to it, we'll share that recording afterwards. And with that, I'll say thank you all so much for being here, and we appreciate your time. And it looks like we'll be ending just a little bit early, so you can get some lunchtime back. Thank you all so much.